Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Chaiva Tato Jayamudirayet. Excuse me. Good. Welcome back. We are first. We're going to do two things today. First, we're concluding this dialogue between. How did I do that? That's a good trick. I'll try it again. All right. So first we have to see the conclusion of this dialogue between Yudhishthira and the Brahmana. And then we're going to start really, I announced earlier, a very intense discussion between Draupadi and Yudhishthira. Sparks are flying. We'll see that in just a few minutes. So where we left off, just to set the stage, you remember the discussion. Yudhishthira, with his brothers and Draupadi, have just entered the forest to begin their years of exile. And upon entering the forest, they're met by a group of Brahmanas. And the Brahmanas are begging for alms. And Yudhishthira explains that they don't have a thing to give the Brahmanas because they've lost everything. And Yudhishthira goes on complaining at some length about his terrible loss that they've all suffered. And then one of the Brahmanas is a very wise man. His name happened to be Shaunaka, as you remember. And this Brahmana starts lecturing Yudhishthira on the main problem that causes suffering. This is our last class. Remember what that the one word that was used, Sanskrit word that was used to describe the root of all suffering. What was the word? Sneha. Sneha will translate as sticky love, clingy love. Love wrapped up with all expectations. And it is absolute, it is so true. And we discussed that at great length in the prior class. I don't want to go over that. By the way, if you miss a class, they're all available on our website, so you can go and pick that up. We're coming towards the end of the Brahmana's Upadesha, the Brahmana's instruction to Yudhishthira. And the last verse we saw in the prior class was actually the beginning of a sequence of verses. So we need to see this verse just to pick up the thread. We've already studied it. So in this verse, the Brahmana says that Yasya, the one for whom the mind is drawn towards sense objects. Indriya grama vishayam prati choditam. When your mind is drawn towards sense objects, then what? Tasya, for that person, autsukyam sambhavati, you get interested. And pravrittihi cha upajayate, and then you get engaged in action. So when your mind is exposed to sense objects, then you get interested. That interest is followed by action. This is a basic principle on which all advertising works. By the way, if advertising didn't work, would advertisers spend billions and billions of dollars each year on advertising if it didn't work? It works. So when you're watching TV and they show that advertisement again and again and again, it works. And if it doesn't work on you, it'll work on someone, for sure. Someone is going to go out and buy that product. And that's what the Brahmana says in this verse. And that is, when you are exposed to an object, Then the manas, the mind, is choritam. It gets compelled. And what is the nature of that compulsion? The first step, we're going to see a series of steps now. The first step is he says, autsukyam. You get interested in the object. When you see that car advertisement, that new Lexus SUV, you see that advertisement again and again. It starts to look pretty good. And sometimes it is followed by the next step, which is pravritti in the last line. And that's as much as we saw in the last class. There are two more verses that describe the sequence of events. So you begin by seeing that Lexus commercial again and again and again. First comes the interest, then comes the pravritti, the engagement in action. And that brings us to the next verse, which we'll see. Tato sankalpa viryena tata sankalpa Oh, sorry. That's why. There we go. This one. Sorry, that's why. Listen again. Tata sankalpa viryena tata sankalpa kamena vishayeshu bihi kamena viddha patati lobhagnao viddha patati jyotir lobhat patangavata. I mean, having given that Lexus commercial, now I'm stuck because now I have to make a connection. But the connection is going to be a little bit of a reach. That's okay. Suppose you can't afford the Lexus. You really want it, you can't afford it. What do? You start working overtime. What does your spouse do? She goes ballistic. How can you're working 80 hours a week. How can you do that? You're neglecting all your stuff at home. So the point is that when we are compelled by sense objects, if we're sufficiently compelled, we end up exercising bad judgment and making mistakes which lead to problems for others and problems for ourselves. That's what's described here. It says, tataha, thereafter. So after seeing the Lexus commercial many times, getting interested, after deciding I'm going to buy a Lexus, after realizing you can't afford the Lexus, and then comes the bad judgment. You commit yourself to working overtime, which causes all kinds of problems at home, and that's what the Brahmana describes here to Yudhishthira. He says, tataha, thereafter, sankalpa viryena, due to the intensity of your desire for that object, kamena, because of that desire, because of the intensity of that desire, skip down to the third line, patati lobhagnao. This is going to be part of a metaphor. Patati, you fall. You fall into what? Agnao, into the agni, into the fire. What kind of fire? Lobha agni, the fire of greed, the fire of desire. You fall into the fire of desire. And he says, Vishayeshu bihi viddhaha. Having been viddhaha, pierced, having been pierced by vishaya issue, having been pierced by arrows of desire. What a nice, arrows of the object, having been pierced by the arrow in the form of the Lexus. How's that? That's a metaphor. Having been pierced by an arrow in the form of the Lexus, what happens to you? Patati, you fall. You fall what? Where? You don't just fall to the ground. That would be relatively harmless. But rather you fall, lobha agnao, you fall into the fire of desire. And what a wonderful metaphor. Jyotihi lobhat patangavat. Patanga is a moth. Patangavat, just like a moth. Lobhat, due to its desire, is drawn into jyotihi, a flame. Look at that. That moth sees that glowing flame. It's attracted by the light. And what happens to the moth? It's drawn into the flame. It is destroyed. Is it destroyed by the flame? Yes. But in a more direct sense, isn't it destroyed by its own desire? You get it. So the moth is destroyed by its own desire. In the same way, when a desire leads you to exercise bad judgment, you end up engaging in self-defeating behavior. So the example I'm giving, to work 80 hours a week so that you can afford this stupid car. Sorry for my language. That is self-defeating behavior, because the negative consequences of working 80 hours a week far outweighs the positive nature of getting that silly car. Self-defeating behavior motivated by desire. Just as that moth is destroyed by its own desire, in the same way, if desire leads you to exercise bad judgment, leading you on the path of adharma leads to what? Destruction of sorts for you and your life. There's one last step. One last part of the consequence of being drawn into that fire of desire. Tato vihararaharair, tato vihararaharair, mohitascha vishampate, mohitascha visham, maha moha mukhe magno, maha moha mukhe magno. Natmanam avabudhyate, natmanam avabudhyate. Tataha, and then the problem continues, or rather, the Brahmana is exploring the consequences, stage after stage, of being the term you've heard me use, being dragged about by our desires. This is a problem, being dragged about by our desires. So here he says, in the second line, Vishampate, the Brahmana addresses Yudhishthira as the pati, the master of Visham. Visham could be the world, could also be other kshatriyas, so the master of all. So he addresses that which is incorrect. This is my translation, by the way. My translation is incorrect. Who's speaking? The Brahmana is speaking. And the Brahmana is speaking to Yudhishthira. Janamejaya is incorrect. That's the outer story. This is the inner. Actually, the middle story is Janamejaya. This is a story within that. So that's absolutely incorrect. And so, O Yudhishthira, because the Brahmana is talking to Yudhishthira here. So, what does he say? Tataha, thereafter, mohitaha, the person being deluded, mohita. Moha describes the problem when our reasoning gets affected by desire. It's a nice definition. When desire is strong enough to distort your reasoning, that's called moha. Nice definition. And here he says, you are deluded by what? Mohita. Deluded by what? Viharaihi, by all pleasurable things. Aharaihi, by all kinds of food and sweet and drinks. Things that you take are ahara. So if you are deluded, if your desire for objects of enjoyment is so strong that it leads to this moha, this perversion of your reasoning. That's the bottom line here. If it leads to the perversion of reasoning, by the way, this is described beautifully in Bhagavad Gita. You should look this up when you go home. Vishayan dhyayato pumsaha, etc., etc. This is chapter 2, I think 54 and 55. No, 64 and 65. I think so. Vishayan dhyayato pumsaha. I think 64 and 65, chapter 2. We've studied it before. Go home and look up that verse. It says, when you go on being exposed to an object of desire, then you want it. Then when you want it, then your reasoning gets disturbed. When your reasoning gets disturbed, then you set aside dharma. When you set aside dharma, you do the wrong action, and finally you get destroyed. It's a sequence of 2 verses. We've called it the slippery slope when we've described that. So you can look that up when you get home. That's being described here in a sequence of verses. So what happens to this person when their reasoning gets perverted due to the strength of desire? Maha moha mukhe magnaha. The person becomes magnaha, submerged. Submerged in maha moha mukhe. Mukha here, the mouth. The mouth represents ocean, and that's a metaphor, because you don't get submerged in a mouth, you get submerged in the ocean, the mouth of the ocean, we can say. You get submerged in an ocean of delusion. That's the expression, maha moha. You get submerged in an ocean of delusion. Why is it an ocean of delusion? How many objects out there in the world are pleasurable and worthy and capable of creating desire? Say it very simply. In this world, how many desirable things are there? Can you start counting? You can start, you can't stop, because the number of pleasurable things in the world are endless. And each and every one of those objects, pleasurable objects, are capable of creating a desire in you intense enough to distort your reasoning. Which means there are an infinite number of threats. And it is a threat when an object becomes so desirable that it distorts your thinking. That object threatens your well-being, threatens your welfare. I think last week I gave the example of long ago when Bill Clinton got in trouble with that girl. So look at that. That girl was a threat for Clinton. That girl was an object of desire so intense that it distorted the president's reasoning and led him to do some very foolish things. It's a threat. And here, that's what the Brahmana wants to emphasize. You become submerged in this ocean of delusion. To be submerged is to perish, to lose yourself. Death is the biggest threat. So you lose yourself in this ocean. You become overwhelmed by all these objects that threaten to distort your reasoning and lead you on the path of adharma. That's the bottom line. And that's what those 2 verses in the Bhagavad Gita reveal. Your reasoning is distorted by desire. You are led to the path of adharma due to the strength of your desires. And there's another consequence. So 2 consequences here are described by the Brahmana. First is you're led to the path of adharma. You are submerged in this ocean of objects of desire, or this ocean of worldly suffering. Samsara Sagara. This ocean is an ocean of delusion, as he says here. It's also the ocean of worldly suffering. Why is it an ocean of worldly suffering? As long as you pursue objects of pleasure in life, Does suffering ever come to an end? This is a heavy question. This doesn't apply to you, so if a person is committed only to pursuing objects of pleasure in life, will that person's suffering ever come to an end? Please note, as long as you're committed only to objects of enjoyment, what happens to the spiritual dimension of your life? No time for it. You're too busy pursuing objects of enjoyment. How many objects of enjoyment are there? Infinite. When will you be satisfied through your process of pursuing all these objects of enjoyment? You'll never be satisfied. When will you undertake a process of spiritual growth to free you from suffering in life? You'll never be free from suffering. You'll always be engaged pursuing these objects of suffering. It's interesting, Hope. It's true. Objects of pleasure equals objects of suffering. Do you understand why? You do. Objects of pleasure, which means mere pleasure. The mere pursuit of pleasure guarantees your continued suffering. Why? Actually, just a 2-minute aside, this comes from commentaries. Commentators love to talk about this, and they'll talk about the limitations of any worldly object. I was just reading in a sub-commentary on Yoga Sutra. It goes into this very nicely. Suppose you have a nice cup of coffee. You go to Starbucks and you get your favorite kind of coffee, whatever that is. And the commentator observes, even while you're enjoying the coffee, already the suffering has begun. And the reasoning goes like this, is that your cup of coffee is half over. And before long, the cup will be empty. And when the cup is empty, it's over. So he says, even while you're enjoying it, already your suffering has begun. Which means no matter how much you enjoy in life, and we can enjoy a lot, we admit it, but all that enjoyment cannot remove suffering. Suffering will come sooner or later. Sooner. It'll come sooner. Look at that. The commentator says, even before you're done with the enjoyment of that cup of coffee, already suffering has come. And even if it's full, there's some other problem that's causing you suffering. Right? Okay, you get it. So, one problem is being submerged in the ocean of suffering. The other problem, he says in the final line, is being prevented from pursuing a life of spiritual growth. He says, na atmanam avabuddhyate. Na avabuddhyate, one does not recognize, one does not know atmanam, his true self. Being submerged in this ocean of delusion, pursuing one object of enjoyment after another, there is no opportunity to discover your true nature, no opportunity for spiritual growth. Let me have a diagram here if I can make out my own writing. Yeah, okay. This is a map of life, and you are here. Question is, where are you going? There are two directions you can go. You can go in a direction of pursuing objects of enjoyment, which is going in a direction of samsara, worldly suffering. As we said, you can go on pursuing one object of enjoyment after another, after another, after another. Do you ever attain a condition of perfect contentment, satiation? It never comes. Desires keep coming one after another, and suffering continues in your life. This is a direction Actually, I'll come back to that. So that's one direction, is a direction of samsara. The other direction is a direction towards moksha, spiritual growth, culminating in liberation, in total freedom. And what's significant is, what is it that propels us in either direction? So in life, we are motivated by various things. What is it that motivates a person, wherever you are in life? What is it that motivates that person towards further, just only towards mere enjoyment of objects of pleasure? What motivates that person, according to this chapter, is sneha. There's that sticky attachment. Remember, we sticky love. We translated, or we described as emotional dependence, and it is so true. Sticky love means emotional dependence. Most of the time, when someone says "I love you," most of the time it means "I need you." Isn't it true? I love you means what? I need you. And if I need you and you're not available, watch out. I'm going to be angry at you. I'm going to be hurt. I'm going to be furious. Watch out. You better be available to meet my emotional needs. That's the sticky love expressed by I love you. So sneha, that sticky love, is best understood as emotional dependence. You consider so many things important for your well-being, and you pursue all those different things that you think will make you feel okay. And guess what? It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And just interesting in the news, what is this lottery is up to some absurd record-breaking number. This lottery, I think, is going to come close to $1 billion. $1,000 million. $1 million you can get your head around. 1,000 millions. Now, can you imagine winning that amount of money? You would think that whoever wins that lottery will be the happiest person on this planet. There have been psychologists who have already studied this and have shown very clearly that 5 years, I think that's the number they used, 5 years, they studied a lot of lottery winners, and they discovered that 5 years after winning the lottery, they were no happier than they were before. Right? Can you imagine, if you win $1,000 million, how happy will you be tomorrow? You can, pretty intense. So that's how happy you will be tomorrow. Well, you better enjoy that while you can, because in 5 years, you'll be back where you started. This has been shown in studies performed by clinical psychologists. So let's get real. And that is, by pursuing pleasures in life, things that we think will make us feel good, it is doomed to failure. No matter how much. If $1,000 million won't make it, what will? My gosh. So recognizing that being driven by our emotional dependence to try to get things and people and experiences to make us feel good about ourselves, that approach is doomed to failure. When you understand this approach is doomed to failure, you get a new motivation. The name for that motivation is actually kind of like an antonym to sneha, vairagya. Vairagya means, we usually translate as dispassion. Sneha, emotional dependence. Vairagya, dispassion. If you have sneha, emotional dependence, you are drawn into a world of suffering. If you realize the inescapable conclusion that no matter how much you gain in life, no matter what you accomplish in life, you will never be fulfilled, you'll never be content, you'll never be completely happy, that recognition gives you vairagya. And that recognition then leads you on the very different path, a path towards spiritual growth, a path towards moksha. So those two paths are given here in this verse. So you can either be maha moha mukhe magnaha, you can be immersed in this ocean of suffering. But if you're immersed in the ocean of suffering, samsara, then na atmanam avabuddhaye, you never discover your true nature. Why? You're going the wrong direction. By going the wrong direction, how will you ever find the fullness of your true nature? Okay, the Brahmana's instruction to Yudhishthira concludes with one more verse. Evam patiti samsare, evam patiti samsar, tasu hayonishu, tasu hayo, avidya karma trishna bhir, avidya karma trishna, brahmyanota chakravata, brahmyanota chakravata. So here the Brahmana makes the observation that not only are you immersed in this ocean of delusion and suffering, you're immersed in this life, and then what happens when you're reborn? You go from one ocean of suffering into another ocean of suffering. Evam, thus, patati, having falling thus, samsare, into this ocean of worldly objects, which is an ocean of suffering, and you fall into that ocean of suffering, tasu iha yonishu. In iha, here in this world, you fall into it, tasu yonishu, in one birth after another. You fall into one womb after another, which means you get born again and again. Each time you are born ignorant. We saw this cycle before. Because of ignorance of your true nature, because of ignorance of the innate fullness of who you already are. Remember, you already are that Satchidananda Atma. Your true nature is already divine, but that inner divinity, that inner fullness is not recognized due to ignorance. You're born with ignorance, ajnana, or avidya, as the next line has it. You're born with avidya. Due to that ignorance, avidya, naturally you have kama, desire. Avidya, ignorance of your own innate fullness, leads to kama, desire. And here in this verse, the word used is trishna. Same thing. Kama and trishna are synonyms. So avidya, ignorance, leads to trishna or kama, desire. And desire leads to what? Karma, action. We saw this in our last class, end of the last class. These same words are wrote up here. Avidya, ignorance of your own innate fullness, leads to kama, desire, leads to karma, action, to pursue that, and you go on accumulating more and more karma. You die without gaining enlightenment. You're born again in a state of ignorance. This is the cycle of life that's described here in the third line. Due to this cycle of avidya, kama, karma. Ignorance leading to desire, leading to engagement, pursuing worldly goals alone. That karma here means specifically that, the pursuit of worldly pleasure. And this leads to the cycle of life, avidya, karma, trishna, bihi. The person is brahmyamanaha ata chakravat ata. Then the person is brahmyamana. It's a causal verb. Literally means made to wander, caused to wander. Chakravat, like a circle, like a wheel, the person is forced to go round and around and around. That verb, brahmyamanaha, as a causal verb, it means you are caused to do it. It's not even a matter of choice. Choicelessly, you are compelled to go through this suffering in this life and life after life after life. It's a compulsion. In fact, it's similar to what psychologists would call an addiction. Earlier we saw the word chodita, compelled. And compelled leads us to make an analogy with an addiction. And we can say that really applies. Most people are addicted to worldly pleasure for the sake of feeling good. Does that make sense? Most people, it's like someone could be addicted to alcohol, addicted to drugs, addicted to gambling. Why are they drawn to those activities? It makes them feel good. Seriously, it won't make you or me feel good, but it makes them feel good. That's why they're addicted. So, just as the alcohol addict takes the alcohol because it makes them feel good, most people are addicted to worldly pleasure. And they pursue objects of pleasure in the world. Why? It makes them feel good. But there are consequences. If you take that alcohol or drugs or gambling, with terrible consequences for that substance abuse and the gambling, what terrible consequences if our lives are narrowly focused only on the attainment of worldly pleasure. What a horrible consequence in that we are deprived a life of spiritual growth, a life of spiritual growth that can really set us free from suffering. But this last line really poignantly points to the fact that just as, this is important, an addict, so if you know anyone who's addicted to alcohol or drugs, you should know they don't choose to be addicted to alcohol or drugs. It is not a choice. That's why doctors call it addiction. When they call it addiction, they mean that this person is powerless over the substance. They don't choose to drink. They are compelled to drink. This is what modern psychology says about alcohol addiction. It's not a failure of character. It's not a failure of will. You read the literature. You read up on the literature and you'll find that modern psychology says that alcohol addiction is not a failure of character. It is not a failure of willpower, but rather they actually characterize it now as an illness. It's an illness in which the person is helpless. Have you ever been ill? Really ill to the point where you are helpless? Somebody has to take care of you when you're sufficiently ill. Someone who's deeply addicted to alcohol or drugs is helpless like that. In the same way, many people in life are helplessly addicted to worldly pleasure. They don't choose. They're addicted. They don't have any choice because they don't know that there is any option out. There is an option. You've discovered that option. That's why we're here today. If you hadn't discovered that there's an option to being addicted to worldly pleasure, you wouldn't be here today. You've discovered that there's another way of living your life. Therefore, we are here. But sadly, Brahmyamanaha Chakravat. For many people, they are helplessly compelled to go around this cycle of vidya, kama, karma again and again and again. All right. Now, we've come to the end of the chapter. Just to make a concluding statement before we go to the next chapter. What would be a healthy attitude towards the world? We've been talking a lot about the unhealthy attitude towards the world, which is based on sneha. Sneha means a sticky love. Sneha means emotional dependence. What would be an alternative? Now, the ultimate alternative is the enlightened person. The enlightened person who has discovered, I am Satchidananda Atma, I am full and complete, therefore my fullness, my happiness, my contentment depends on nothing. Well, that state of enlightenment may be at some distance. So what to do in the meanwhile for a sadhaka en route on that path of spiritual growth before they get enlightened? What would be an alternative to the sneha? What would be a more mature kind of love, a more mature attitude towards people and possessions and acquisition, towards worldly enjoyments? Here's I remember Puja Swami Tadatmananda talking about a conversion of attitude, and he said the attitude is converted from being the owner of something. These are his exact words. Instead of ownership, you think of yourself as a trustee. Now, that needs to be explained. Ownership and being a trustee. Let me give you a metaphor. Let me develop this properly for you. We spoke at some length, I think in the last class or the class before that, about a parent's relationship with children. And for most parents, if not all parents, sneha, sticky love, is a major, major factor. Why? The parents derive a lot of pleasure from their children. The parents have emotional dependence on children. The parents have a sense of myness about their children. Parents have a sense of ownership over their parents. All of this is described by the word sneha. And Puja Swamiji used to talk about this at length. In fact, he would give lectures to parents. He wouldn't wave his finger like this, but with his voice, he would do the equivalent of challenging these attitudes of parents. And he says, you don't own your children. They're given to you. They're gifts. That's in Sanskrit, if you want to say just an ordinary name, just so and so, like in English we might use a word like John Smith just as a generic name. So in Sanskrit, the generic name is Devadatta. Is the generic name in Sanskrit. Just like John Smith in English, Devadatta means what? One who is datta, given by Deva, God. The generic person is Devadatta, one who's given by God. Every child is Devadatta. Every child is given by God. You don't own that child. You are a trustee over that child. God has given you that child to take care of, not to depend on. You have the responsibility of raising that child, bringing up that child, educating that child, preparing that child for worldly life. You are not preparing that child to take care of you in your old age. Now, you won't think like that, but some people do. They're preparing their children to take care of them in their old age. This is looking at a child as a possession, looking at yourself as the owner. Children are not your possessions. You are given the child. You are a trustee. The trustee is one who has temporary possession and one who has complete responsibility. Temporary possession and complete responsibility. It's like if you borrow someone's car, you have temporary possession, but as long as you have the car, you have full responsibility over that car. You have to take care of it. In fact, what's interesting, just to finish this metaphor, is if you have a borrowed car, if you borrowed a car from a good friend, you'll take care of the car better than your own car. True? So don't think that just looking at your child as looking at yourself as a trustee over your children doesn't mean you don't care about them. In fact, you'll care for them better if you are the trustee and not the owner. Suppose we had that attitude of trusteeship over everything in life. Whatever we possess, we don't own. Whatever we possess, we've been given temporarily. It's so true. After all, in several decades, when we die, what will happen to all that we own? We don't own it. We've been given temporary possession over all of this. We don't own it. It's given, and from the standpoint of the Bhagavad Gita that teaches karma yoga, we can say whatever we possess is given by Ishvara, given by God. And we possess it temporarily, and as trustees, we are required to be responsible with our possessions, with our families, with our jobs, with friendships, with whatever it is in life. We don't own it. We are given it, and we have an opportunity to be responsible in how we handle it. If we have this attitude, sneha is gone, and we act responsibly, we act with maturity. And this is the final part of our discussion of this chapter about the discussion between Yudhishthira and the Brahmana, coping with loss. Okay, let's begin this next chapter. You remember that I've chosen these selected chapters. I've selected them very carefully for their value to teach us an important lesson. So we're going to begin now another section of the Aranyaka Parva, which is quite long. We said in a couple of classes ago, they spent how many years? 12 years in this, 13 years in the forest. So that's why it's 299 chapters long. And we're going to come to chapters 28 and 30, which is a dialogue between Draupadi and Yudhishthira. In chapter 28, we hear Draupadi. In chapter 30, we hear Yudhishthira. In chapter 28, which we'll start in just a moment, we find Draupadi is angry. Of course she is angry. She's been dragged out of her comfortable palace by her husband, who's apparently addicted to gambling. And just to make it sound like a more of an American story, so somebody has just lost her house. Well, and she's now living in a shelter. She's been kicked out of her house. The house was repossessed by the bank. We have to make this a typical American story. The house was repossessed by the bank. She is now living in a shelter. Why? Her husband gambled away their entire fortune. Wouldn't that person be angry? Well, this is Draupadi's situation. She is angry, and she's going to let Yudhishthira have it, as they say in English. Now, before we begin, it's an entire chapter in which Draupadi expresses her anger. As we go through this chapter, let us reflect on Draupadi's anger. Let's try to understand something about her anger and about anger in general. And here's what we have to understand. What is the source of anger? Where does anger come from? Conventional wisdom has it that when your boss is shouting at you, your boss is the source of your anger. Conventional wisdom has it if your mother-in-law is on your case, as they say, then your mother-in-law is the source of your anger. This is the conventional way of looking at life, the conventional way of looking at people, and it is wrong. Absolutely wrong. The source of anger is not outside of you. The source of anger comes from within. Let's develop this just for a minute, and then we'll see these verses. Puja Swamiji said something. One of the earliest teachings I remember hearing from him in the 1980s, early 1980s. He said something based on the psychology taught in the Bhagavad Gita. Based on Sri Krishna's psychological teachings in the Bhagavad Gita, Puja Swami Dayananda said that he defined anger with these exact words. He said, anger is obstructed desire. His exact words. Anger is obstructed desire. Now, what did he mean by that? When you are prevented from fulfilling a desire, what do you feel? Well, it depends. If it's a trivial desire, you don't feel anything. If it's a little more than trivial desire, you might feel irritated. If it's a pretty big desire, you might feel a little bit concerned, a little tense. And if it's something you really, really, really want, and someone or something is preventing you from fulfilling your desire, what do you feel? Anger. That's why Puja Swamiji said, anger is obstructed desire. And if anger is due to desire, desire comes from where? The desire comes from you, the desire is within you, therefore where does the anger come from? If anger is obstructed desire, the desire is coming from you, the anger is coming from you. The source of anger is not outside, any more than the source of desire is not outside, right? The source of desire is not outside. The source of desire is your sense of incompleteness. If you felt absolutely content and full and complete, would you desire anything at all? No. Only because every person is born with this sense of incompleteness, sense of inadequacy, sense of something missing. What Puja Swamiji called the fundamental problem. Failing to recognize your own innate fullness, you experience yourself as incomplete, as insufficient, as lacking. He called that the fundamental problem. The source of desire is clearly within. And since desire gives rise to anger when it's obstructed, the source of anger is within. We cannot blame external people and situations for our anger. Anger comes from within. And that's actually good. Why is it good news? If the problem is outside of you, most of the time you can't do much about it. If the problem is your boss, if you want a job, You have to deal with it. If your problem is your mother-in-law, well, you married into the family, you're stuck. If the problem is a boss or mother-in-law, there may not be a solution. If the problem is inside of you, there's hope. And so with this orientation, we're going to now examine Draupadi's anger and see if it isn't true for her. She's going to blame Duryodhana, obviously. She's also going to blame Yudhishthira for obvious reasons. So she's going to blame, but now the question is Draupadi's anger really due to Duryodhana and Draupadi? Let's begin. Let's see what she says. We'll try to go through these verses a little bit more quickly. All right. Draupadyuvacha, Yes tvam rajan maya sardham, yes tvam rajan maya ajanai prativasitam, ajanai bhratrabhyascha tatha sarvar, bhratrabhyascha tatha nabhyabhashatak Kinchana, nabhyabhashata kinchana, vanam prasthapya dushtatma, nanvatapyata durmatihi. This verse has 3 full lines. Let's see what this verse says. So, Draupadi uvacha, she said, start on this one. She's talking about Duryodhana, who here she calls Duryodhana Dushtatma, one who has an evil heart. Atma here means heart. Dushtatma, the evil-hearted Duryodhana. Vanam prasthapya, having thrown us out into the forest. So that evil-minded Duryodhana, having thrown us out into the forest, bottom line, na abhyabhashata kinchana. He didn't say kinchana. He didn't say anything. He just threw us out of our palace without saying a thing. And us, yahat tvam rajan maya sardham tvam, you, Rajan, O king. She's addressing Yudhishthira. O king, she is king, tvam, you, maya sardham, together with me. In the third line, bhratrabhicha sarvaihi, and also with all the brothers. So you and me and all of our brothers, and we are ajanaihi, all of us really, but you, Yudhishthira, ajanaihi prativasitam, dressed in deerskins, prativasitam. They used to be wearing all costly dress when they lived in the palace. Now they're dressed in deerskins, and she complains that Duryodhana threw us out of the palace, you and me and your brothers, and he threw us out of the palace, na abhyashyata kinchana, without saying anything, and na anvyatapyata durmatihi. Durmatihi, almost the same meaning. Somebody who doesn't think properly, someone whose mind is perverted is durmatihi, talking about Duryodhana. And what about Duryodhana? Na anvatapyata. He didn't express any regret. He didn't say anything. He didn't express any regret. He kicked us out of our palace without even saying, I'm sorry. That's what she said. Na anvatapyata. He didn't express any regret. Na anvatapyata. And she's angry because Duryodhana kicked her out of the palace without saying, I'm sorry. Huh? Does that mean if Duryodhana said he's sorry, then it would be okay? This is really so typical. When we are angry, our words reflect our emotions. and not necessarily the reality of the situation. Look at the reality of the situation was a rigged dice game by which Duryodhana caused Yudhishthira and his brothers to be thrown out of the of the kingdom. They all know that. And Draupadi knows that. And she is extremely angry. And with her anger, when she says, Na anyatapyata durmatihi, that evil-minded Duryodhana didn't express any regret, wait a minute, is that a reasonable expectation that Duryodhana should express regret? Is that reasonable? It's absolutely unreasonable. So look at this. She has an expectation that Duryodhana should feel bad about what happened. Draupadi feels that Duryodhana should feel bad about what happened. Duryodhana doesn't feel bad, and therefore Draupadi is angry. Draupadi has a desire. What is her desire? That Duryodhana should feel bad. Does Duryodhana feel bad? He feels the opposite. He's delighted. And that drives her crazy. Do you see, this is the first instance we're seeing of Pujya Swamiji's definition. Anger is obstructed desire. Draupadi has an expectation that Duryodhana should feel bad. He doesn't feel bad. Her expectation, her desire is obstructed, therefore she feels angry. We'll see that in more detail here. Sukho chitam aduhkarham, sukho chitam aduhkar, duratma sasuhrid ganaha, duratma sasuhrid gana, idrasham dukham haniya, idrasham dukham ha, modate papa purushaha, modate papa purushaha. Start in the second line. Duratma, again talking about that evil-minded Duryodhana. Sa suhrit ganaha, together with his group of friends. What did they do? Duryodhana with his friends, what did they do? Idrasham dukham aniya. Aniya. They brought upon us. Idrasham dukham. So much suffering. They brought to us. They brought to us, and we are, in the top line, we are sukha uchitam. We deserve happiness. And we are adukha arham. We don't deserve suffering. We deserve happiness. We don't deserve suffering. But Duryodhana and his friends have brought about such suffering to us. And as a result, she says in the last line, and modate. Papa Purushaha. Papa Purushaha, that sinner, that sinful person, what does he do? Modate. He rejoices. Having caused us so much suffering, he rejoices. You can imagine how she feels. She feels like we are suffering so much that Duryodhana is back in the palace living it up. So you can imagine how she feels, but tell me, her expectation that Duryodhana should not be happy, that Duryodhana should feel sad or regretful about that's a totally unrealistic expectation. On the other hand, it is so natural for one who is angry as she is. This is something we're going to discuss. As we go through this chapter, we're going to see example after example of how her anger comes about because anger has disturbed her thinking. By the way, that's true not only about Draupadi. What happens when any person gets angry? Anger disturbs our reasoning, distorts our reasoning, and leads us to all kinds of silly conclusions and thinking which actually make us suffer more. In this case, she's suffering more because she has this false expectation that Duryodhana should feel bad about what he did. It's a ridiculous expectation. Just to make that point very clear, because some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, Duryodhana did something terrible. Shouldn't he feel some sense of guilt over what he did? When in the forest, when a wild animal like a tiger leaps upon a defenseless deer, Bambi. When a tiger leaps upon a defenseless deer and consumes that deer for lunch, should the tiger feel guilty? For the tiger, that is natural behavior. For Duryodhana, who is Durmatihi, for Duryodhana, whose thinking is perverted, it is natural behavior for Duryodhana. And she doesn't get it. To get angry, can you imagine, would you get angry at that tiger? How could the tiger do that? That's what tigers do. How could Duryodhana throw his cousins out of the palace? That's what Duryodhana does. When you're driving down the road and someone cuts you off and you get angry, how could they do that? That's what they do. What a silly question. How could they do that? Tigers pounce on deer. Duryodhana throws them out of the palace. That's what they do. And the person who cut you off on the road, that's what they do. And for us to expect the world to be otherwise, and this is the final comment for today, our expectation that the world should be the way we want it to be. How is that? Tigers should not jump on innocent little Bambis. And certainly, while you're driving down the road, no one should ever cut you off. Everyone should treat you with immense respect and courtesy. Come on! These are absurd expectations, and it's these expectations that get trashed. And then how do you feel when that person cuts you off? Angry. So one, we're going to see as in the next class, we'll see other reasons, but right now we're seeing that false expectations lead to anger. Draupadi's false expectations leads to her anger. Your expectation that no one should ever cut you off, everyone should drive courteously, those expectations cause anger. The source of anger is not the driver. The source of anger is your expectation. Is it not so? Okay. We'll see more in our next class. Tomorrow, Sunday, we have our program for teenagers at 11 o'clock. We also have the Gita at Work study group. You're welcome to come, 11 o'clock tomorrow. 5 p.m. is a mindful awareness meditation. Meditation at 5, 6:15, question and answer satsang session that I'll conduct. Library will be open after class. We'll conclude with our prayers. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.